Good evening, viewers. I am Dragon 1813, your host this evening. So welcome to Dragon's Classical Theater. Today, you are going to hear one of Grimm's most popular tales of elves, those little sprite-like creatures that sometimes cause mischief, or sometimes even help you. This is the story of the helpful kind. It is the story of the Elves and the Cobbler. Once upon a time, there was a very old cobbler. That's someone who makes shoes. He was very old, but he was very kind. He lived alone with his wife, and they were very successful. However, good things don't always last forever. Soon they fell on hard times, and they began losing money. Eventually, the cobbler only wound up with enough money just to buy enough leather for one pair of shoes. But he was very hard-working, and he was very optimistic. So he bought the leather. And all day, his feeble hands worked at the leather, cutting out the pieces just perfectly. For he always did everything just right. Well, once he had cut out all the leather, all he had to do was basically just sew them together. But it was late, so the cobbler decided to call it a night. So he and his wife blew out the lamps and went to bed. The cobbler got up early the next morning to sew the leather together and make the new shoes. But when he got out there, the leather was gone. But in its place was a very fine pair of shoes, already made, right there on his work table. The cobbler was dumbfounded. He didn't know what had happened. But there's an old saying that says, never look a gift horse in the mouth. So the cobbler took the shoes and set them in the window. And sure enough, a noblewoman came by, and she saw the shoes, and she just absolutely loved them. She went inside and told the cobbler that she wanted to buy the shoes. So she tried them on, and they fit her perfectly. And she loved how they fit, and so she bought them. As the cobbler counted the money she gave him, he realized that she had paid him enough money to buy more leather, enough to make 2 pairs of shoes. So he went out and bought the leather, and he worked all day cutting out the leather. Once he had all cut it out, once again, it had gotten late. So he decided to call it a night, and he would finish them in the morning. But sure enough, when he got up early the next morning, the shoes were complete again. 2 of the finest shoes you'd ever seen. Better than anything the shoemaker had ever made before. Well, no sooner had he put them in the window than a young man came to the door. He spied the shoes and went inside and offered to buy both of them. One for him and one for his girlfriend, because they were going to go dancing at the Duke's ball later that evening. So the cobbler sold the shoes to the young man. When he counted up the money, he had enough money to buy leather to make 4 pairs of shoes. And so this went on. Every day he would cut out the leather, go to bed, and the next morning all the pieces of leather would somehow mysteriously be sewn and pinned and painted and nailed together in the proper places to forming the most beautiful shoes the cobbler had ever seen. Well, this went on for a long time, and the cobbler got his wealth back, and soon he became a very, very rich man. But he and his wife became curious. They wondered, how is it that the shoes make themselves? Is that possible? So they decided to see what happens. The cobbler went out and bought leather to make a couple of shoes. There was no hurry. He had plenty of shoes in stock. So he just bought enough for 2 shoes, set them out, and then that night, rather than going to bed, he and his wife I snuck over to the corner of the room where they could see everything in the workshop and hid themselves behind a screen. They waited and waited, and about midnight, the door flew open, even though it was locked fast. And in hopped 2 elves. Tiny little elves with twinkling eyes and long pointy ears, with long hair. But they were only about 3 feet tall each. They seemed very young, but their eyes stated that they were much older. They looked around, saw the leather, and instantly got to work. They picked up the leather and began sewing in a way that was almost magical. For as they sewed, they just picked up an empty needle and began working it through the leather, and thread just appeared there. Once it was sewn, they took a dry brush, stroked it across the leather, and instantly it turned into the most beautiful colors. In less than an hour, both of the pairs of shoes were complete and just as spectacular as before. The elves stood back, admired their work, shook hands, and then ran out the door, and the door fastened behind them, just like it was before. So now the cobbler and his wife knew what had happened. Now they knew who to thank for their newfound wealth and success. But the cobbler's wife was sad for them as well, for she noticed that although they seemed happy, they barely wore any warm clothes. In fact, the only clothes they wore were just weather-worn rags, and their fingers were white with work and with the cold. She figured they must be miserable in spite of how well they work. So, she got an idea. She and her husband would make gifts for them. She got her sewing kit out and began stitching out a couple of outfits. Fine shirts, tunics, vests, some nice hats, and some nice pants for them. And the cobbler took out some new leather and began stitching out a pair of fine shoes for each of them. They figured it was a small way to repay them for the kindness they had been shown. Once they were finished, they set the gifts on the work table, but no leather this time, just the gifts. And then they went back and hid behind the screen once again and waited. And at the stroke of midnight, just as before, the doors flung open and in hopped the 2 little elves. They looked around, and at first they were sort of confused. They wondered, where was the leather? Are we not needed here anymore? But then they looked at the table and saw the gifts. They stared at them for a moment and then realized that they were just their size. And then they got the idea. They're for us, they said, and they were overjoyed. So quickly, they wasted no time in putting on their fine clothes. They looked at themselves. It was in a mirror that the cobbler had on the wall. Not only were the clothes very warm and very sturdy, but they were also very stylish. The elves danced around and just enjoyed the fact that they were finally wearing good, beautiful clothes. And one said, "Look how stunning we look. Why, with these clothes, we can get invited to all the fine balls held by the kings and queens." The other one says, "Yes, now we don't have to work anymore." And so, taking each other by the hand, they danced around the room, danced out the door, closing it behind them, and they never came back. But there was no need for them now, for now the cobbler had made enough money to where he could run his business in peace and retire. But he and his wife In all their success, they never forgot who had granted them this success, and they never forgot the kindness of the two little elves. And I'm sure that wherever they are, the elves never forgot them and their kindness as well. And they all lived happily ever after. The end. Thank you, viewers. I hope you enjoyed this. Good night.